journey for Maria. "Assunta, I tell you, we'd do better to leave this place," Luigi exclaimed. But the mother only bent over the fire and banked the embers. The flame glowed warmly. Their 3 children, gathered about the hearth, spread their hands to the heat. Assunta straightened up and heaved a sigh, but said nothing. "You know, I was talking to the Cimarellis last night. They are leaving in the spring," he continued. It was like a shock to her. Assunta guessed immediately that her husband had reached a decision with their neighbor. He was trying to break the news gently. For several winters now, the idea of immigrating had tempted him. Luigi was a hard-working farmer, a man of action. On bad days, when snow and rain confined him to pacing the kitchen from window to door, from door to cupboard and back again, he could not help complaining about the land and climate. It was useless to argue with him, thought Assunta. She had tried it often. Early she had learned that discussion was futile, so now she was ready to accept what she could not prevent. She fought back the tears. "Then you wish that we leave with them?" she asked. Her voice was calm and slow. Luigi looked at her, but her eyes remained fixed on the flames. She seemed resigned. He had not expected so easy a victory. "Yes, Assunta, we must. We can no longer remain here. Over there you will be much happier, believe me. In the neighborhood of Rome there are vacant farms and lands to be leased. We will find ourselves something worthwhile." The storm door slammed. A blizzard was at its height. Snow was falling heavily. Winters are severe in the neighborhood of Ancona, and though one might well love that country for its pure air and steep pathways, when storms arise and fuel is low, it can become a land of misery. There was a long silence in the Goretti home. The 2 boys and Maria continued to warm themselves by the fire. Assunta passed a damp cloth over the table she had just cleared. She was a farm-bred, healthy woman, in her early 30s, slender still, in spite of the loose skirts that hung in folds about her. Luigi watched her work. Her slow movement spoke more eloquently than words of the painful fatigue and discouragement. He understood that she had just accepted the hardest sacrifice of her life. She was attached to this village, where she had always lived, where her parents lay buried. She had known no other horizon than these mountain slopes. With him it was different. As a soldier, he had traveled over the Apennines and through the fertile plains beyond. Why should one kill oneself in these mountains steeped in rock, rubble, and harsh weather for reasons of sentiment, he had asked himself time and time again. The cold weather whistled under the door. The 3 youngsters were becoming sleepy by the hearth. Assunta was now washing the dishes. Luigi's anguish mounted. With his fingernail he scraped a hole in the frost on the window pane. A huge blanket of white covered everything, and the snow continued. There was no end of it. It was up to the height of the well now. The stone bench and the rose bushes were buried from sight. Then a little hand slipped into his own. He lowered his eyes, and the hard lines in his face softened. It was his darling Maria, who had come to press herself to his side. He kissed her forehead and ran his fingers through her long chestnut hair. This little girl of 6 was his favorite. She had indeed a temper that broke out occasionally, but in her calmer moments she was so affectionate and sweet. She turned her limpid eyes to her father and begged him to take her in his arms. Her rosy cheeks reminded Luigi of warmth and sunshine out beyond the Apennines on the shores of the Mediterranean. At length the winter passed. The snow melted and rivers rushed madly to the sea. Then one bright morning Luigi loaded his cart, hitched up his oxen, and drove slowly away from Corinaldo. All he had left was his household goods and a few hundred lire, for he had sold his cottage and his field. The 2 boys, Angelo and Marino, aged 9 and 4, played amid the bundles of belongings. Assunta, sitting in front with Maria and Luigi, was nursing a newborn child, Alessandro. The Cimarelli cart followed behind them. Domenico and Luigi had always been close neighbors. Teresa and Assunta, friends from childhood, would not have wished to be separated for anything in the world. Together they crossed the Apennines. Together they followed the winding road toward Rome. It took them several weeks to make the 200-mile journey by ox cart. At times, Luigi walked behind, deep in thought. Maria watched the white mountain peaks fade in the distance. In her young mind was impressed forever that last picture, the great snowy heights of Coronaldo reaching heavenward, home in the swampland. They arrived at last, but Luigi soon began to think it were better had they never come. For 2 days the Gorettis and Cimarellis wandered the streets of Rome. To these simple farmers, the great city was a universe. They knew not where to go, helplessly wandering about, retracing their steps. A dozen times they repassed the same place without noticing it. They visited churches, prayed before the Virgin statues, lit candles, called on the saints. Yet, despite the prayers, a pitiless fate seemed to steer them toward their ruin. From a chance acquaintance, they learned that Count Mazzoleni owned rich lands in the neighborhood of Nettuno. He rented them out, they were told, at a reasonable price, or better still, he ceded them on a profit-sharing basis. They were supposed to be good farms, lands that furnished a rich livelihood regardless of the year. There were swamps there too, and the climate was damp, but that should not stop anyone. Why not go there, the stranger suggested. You can see for yourself. I know the place. It belongs to the district of Conca. Stop off at Ferrier and inquire. They'll tell you where it is. Luigi and Domenico thanked the good man and set off without further delay. If only they had known what lay in store for them. As they approached the marshes, the air became heavy. Heavy, too, was the cart in which the children, tired of their cramped quarters, began to complain. Maria alone was patient and quiet. With her little legs hanging over the back of the cart, she thought on many things. The heavy wheels rumbled on the pavement. She was not worried or concerned about where this strange adventure would end, and it little mattered to her where they would be by dusk. She noted that they were leaving the city. Little by little, all that great world was left behind, its many people, its beautiful churches, its great houses stuck close one upon the other. Soon they were out in the open country, and vineyards and fields of wheat and corn appeared. It was hot, and she was thirsty, but Father had said there would be no stopping. The oxen trudged along. Luigi was whistling in contentment. Domenico cracked his whip. When they saw afar off the first houses of Ferrier, they sighed with relief. The journey had been long. Luigi stood up and peered through the trees at a turn in the road. He noticed that there was no church spire. But then you cannot expect everything. He urged on his beast, and in short time they were in the midst of the poor village. No shops welcomed them. Not a door nor window was ajar along the dirty road. It was siesta time and apparently strictly observed. Luigi knocked 3 times at one of the houses. There was no reply, but movements within gave hope of an answer. The door was unbolted, and a wrinkled old lady peered through the opening with blinded eyes. "Could you tell me where to find Count Mazzoleni's farm?" Luigi asked. The old woman was not quite awake, and it was necessary to repeat louder. "Oh, you mean the old cheese factory?" She took a step forward in the doorway. "It's over there on your left. The last place, you can't miss it." They found the place all right. It was an oblong, tile-roofed building set on a rise of ground. All about it was flat, low-lying, swampy farm. The children piled out of the cart and began exploring the yard. The heat was intense. There were no trees about the place, nor shade of any description. Everything seemed dead. The hen house was empty and the stone watering trough scorched and dry. Luigi and Assunta looked over the farm, visited the stable and shed, went through the kitchen and 2 rooms of the house, then climbed the stairway to the upper floor. They met neither dog nor cat nor any other living thing. And thus, without a seeing anyone, they took possession of Ferrier Farm. Next day the arrangements were settled. Luigi and Domenico became sharecroppers of Count Mazzoleni. The Cimarellis took over the house adjacent to that of the Gorettis. They were not partners, just neighbors. Assunta very quickly had the place cleaned and swept. Misery was stalking them, but hope was adamant. It was a dangerous situation for this family, accustomed to the invigorating air of the mountain heights. to become stranded on the edge of the Pontine marshes, which were damp and unhealthy, a hotbed of malaria. But Luigi set about his work courageously. No longer was he working with little plots, one higher than the other, as at Coronaldo. Here, low-lying fields and meadows stretched out in flat panorama. For the past 3 years, the property had been neglected. The preceding hired man had lived on the spontaneous yield of the ground without taking any pains to develop its resources. Neglected ditches failed to carry off the excess water which spread out in pools over the land. With great energy, Luigi tried to bring the land under control. Ditch digging occupied him for the rest of the summer. The water seeped off and plowing began. By fall he was able to sow 8 acres in wheat and barley. But such rugged labor in the heat and damp of the Pontine marshes was too much, even for the robust farmer of the mountain country. His strength was undermined. The first attacks of fever were light, and he paid no attention to them. Assunta urged him to rest. But Luigi could not remain idle and set out to work as though nothing were the matter. A few days later, coughing commenced, and then he was obliged to admit his defeat. For a week he lay in bed suffering from bronchial trouble. But no sooner was he up again than he set about working on the roadway, and for 2 weeks hauled rocks and stone from the quarry. Then hedge trimming and firewood took up his attention. On through the winter he worked desperately, in spite of continued weakness and a bothersome cough. As soon as the land was in shape, he undertook repair of the buildings. Repair of roofs, cleaning of lofts, partitions in the stable. One task followed another, one project gave rise to others. He went and came without rest, without thought of the dread disease that was undermining his health. Meanwhile, in the home, Maria was maturing rapidly. Her eyes were opening upon life, her hands learning the family arts. Before too long, death would come to pay a visit, and hardship already hovered over Ferrier. Coming of the Serenellis, harvest time came. Luigi sharpened his sickle and set out early. He was counting on doing it alone. If he hired no one to help bring in the crop, there would be more sustenance for his family. That was his last imprudence. In the first days, all went well. The sheaves accumulating behind him lent ardor to his task. For hours at a time he bent over the furrows, dripping with sweat, not pausing an instant. It was foolish for him to work so hard. Each evening he came back more worn out than the preceding day. He went to bed with hardly any supper. At this rate he could not carry on. Toward the end of the week he became dizzy, and one whole afternoon he lay helpless in the field. When he finally struggled back to the house, he was breathing heavily. The next morning he was unable to go to Sunday, Massachusetts at Campo Morto. Monday he was prostrate in bed, unable even to think of returning to work. That same morning, Count Mazzoleni came to examine his Ferrier farm. He was quite dismayed to see Luigi's harvest delayed more than that of his neighbors. Their crops were practically in the barn, while Luigi's crops, half mowed, lay limp upon the field. The grain was overripe, and any day it might fall. The Count could not understand why the bundles had not been gathered up. Luigi was apparently lying down on the job. Mazzoleni was quite angry and resolved to let his hired man know his mind. He stormed into the house and vented his wrath upon the sick man. Luigi knew not what to reply. He tried to explain and finished by admitting that he would not be able to bring in the harvest. He would have to have help, at least for a time. After that, he would be able to maintain the farm. "I'll send you 2 men tomorrow," Count Mazzoleni cut in. "The harvest can't wait any longer. Giovanni Serenelli and his son came to me this morning looking for work. I'll send them to you, and you can make your own arrangements." Luigi remained silent. His weakness and the thought of having to share the fruits of his labors were heavy upon him. Whatever the price, there was no other solution. It remained to be seen how Assunta would take it. He called his wife and decided to tell her, but then his courage failed him. She, too, was overburdened with work. A few weeks ago she had given birth to Ercilia and was too occupied with the children even to sit down for supper. Luigi watched her straighten up the sick room and kept silent. He realized how 2 more men in the house would be a terrible burden on her. She certainly would not agree to lodge and feed them. Slowly plans turned about in his mind. He could lend them his ox cart to take them to Nettuno each evening and back again in the morning. Or again, he might find them lodging in the village somewhere. But each idea was so impractical: lack of time, lack of lodging. Besides, he was not able to hire them at a fixed salary. He had not 50 light to his name. Of necessity, he must take them into partnership and cede them part of the house. Then another series of insurmountable difficulties crowded in upon him. Luigi was not well, and his troubles wore him down. When the children were asleep, Assunta returned. The husband and wife said their evening prayers together and put out the light. Tomorrow, Luigi thought, I'll tell her, and made a great effort to lose his troubles in sleep. Giovanni Cirinelli and his son knocked on the door early next morning and introduced themselves in the provincial speech of Ancona. Surprise and embarrassment yielded to the tale of hardship and want. At first, Assunta did not understand the object of their visit. As she dressed the children in the bedroom, she followed the conversation in the kitchen. They spoke in her native dialect and of persons and places that were dear to her. Giovanni seemed to be about 60. He had an easy flow of speech and knew how to touch Luigi with the recital of his miseries. His wife had died in an insane asylum. Another son was still there. The other children were married and settled in the region about Ancona. He was left alone and penniless with this youngest son, Alessandro. Luigi looked at the young man. He was well built and apparently strong beyond his 18 years. At length they came to the vital question. Giovanni proposed sharing work and profits on a 50-50 basis. Count Mazzoleni, he said, proposed that arrangement yesterday evening. Besides, we don't need much in the way of lodging. We can all eat together and we'll get along fine. Old Cirinelli was very amicable and would not hear of detailed conditions. What he wanted most, he said, was a home and family life. He had suffered enough loneliness since the death of his wife. Luigi was touched with sympathy and gave in. Even Assunta did not dare interfere. The deal was concluded, and the newcomers began their work immediately. The following Monday, Luigi accompanied Giovanni and his son to Nettuno to get their furniture and belongings. The trio returned together. 2 iron beds were set up in a room Assunta had prepared. Their meatloaf and bread were put in the cupboard with the Goretti food supply. Their clothing was hung in the family press. In the evening they supped together. The common life had begun, misunderstanding and mourning. For the first few days, even the first weeks, all went well in the Goretti home. It is rather easy to get along with those who come from one's own native place and speak one's own dialect. Giovanni and Alessandro were out to work early. The harvest was under control. Assunta prepared her best meals. The children were happy, and after work hours they played with the new boy. He taught them how to catch birds. He could make reed whistles. They were fascinated by the things he could do. A bit of joy returned to the Goretti household. Hope lighted again. The sheaves of wheat piled up in the barn. Better days are coming, thought Luigi. As long as the heavy work lasted, there was no misunderstanding or discussion. The newcomers were hard workers. They lost no time, and in the evening they were too tired to wrangle. After the harvest, the sale of the produce and the plowing kept them busy. Then winter set in, with its long days of rain and idleness. Time hung on their hands. Old Cirinelli took to drinking. The habit that poverty had driven out reasserted itself. The wine of those southern lands is strong, and though he rarely became drunk, his character soured. He was irritable, overbearing and dissatisfied. Alessandro, too, began to show evil tendencies. Having lost his mother in childhood, he had a void in his heart. He resented the fact that he had been left to the careless tutelage of a cousin, then to an aunt. His own father had taken no interest in him. At the age of 12, he had found work with the stevedores. In that first apprenticeship, He had learned the foulest language of the sea and would curse and swear on the least provocation. At 15, he led a lonely life. His character was warped, and the family life at Ferrier could not alter it. He became increasingly taciturn, shunned the children, had no friends and visited no one. When the others went to mass at Nettuno or Campo Morto, he went off by himself. Assunta noted that he went regularly to a newsstand and came back with a bundle of lurid magazines. He would then lock himself in his room and would not come out for the rest of the day. This brooding had an evil effect on him. His manner darkened, and something of the sneak appeared in his look. Assunta became alarmed. She wondered what was going on in his soul, and soon, to her grief, she would learn. The next time Assunta cleaned Alessandro's room, she saw with dismay that he had clipped a number of immodest pictures from the magazines and had hung them about his bed. Her first impulse was to seize them and put them in the fire. But she refrained. That would only start a quarrel and bring more trouble into the home. Perhaps it would be better not to interfere. She was not, after all, responsible for his conduct. His father knew of these things, and it was up to him to take action. But she resolved to watch over her eldest, Angelo. He was approaching his teens, and the evil influence of a good-for-nothing might lead him astray. She strictly forbade him to enter the Serenelli room. She did not breathe a word, even to Luigi, of her discovery. Things went from bad to worse. Luigi suspected that Giovanni was slyly disposing of grain from their common store. That needed to be settled. He proposed separation in equal lots of the produce. The terms of agreement between friends would have to be made practical. Giovanni became exacting. There was quarreling and harsh words. It might have gone to blows if Luigi had not ceded for the sake of peace in the home. The poor man sighed for his mountain home. He regretted especially having admitted these two men to his fellowship. If he could only stand up against them and maintain his paternal authority. But he felt weak in the face of them and capitulated. Malaria had undermined his strength, and during the winter it accomplished its work. By spring a subtle apathy laid hold of him. Chills came and went at intervals, but he held on stubbornly. He tried not to complain and went out to work with apparently the same ardor, only he never seemed to urge on his oxen as before. In the evening he sat down as soon as he entered the house, but ate very little. Assunta noted his exhaustion, his pallid complexion, and the dark circles under his eyes, but what was to be done? She dared not say anything. The contract to work must be kept. Toward the end of April he went to bed. The sickness was making great strides. Maria ran over to Nettuno for quinine, but it brought little relief. In less than 10 days Luigi's strength was gone. His breathing was quick and measured. His pale arms lay limp on the covers. The little children, without too well understanding the significance, knelt about the bed in prayer. Maria especially, his own little Maria, redoubled her fervent prayers and wept in silence. One afternoon, Luigi had a spasm of suffocation. He threw his head back and remained still, his hands tense. Assunta was alarmed. Giovanni and Alessandro were out in the fields. She sent Maria in haste to get help. The little girl hurried out and notified all the neighbors. When she got back, Luigi had regained consciousness. She went over to his bed. A smile of tenderness played about his lips, and with his icy hand he touched the moist forehead of his darling. "How warm you are, Maria. Where have you been?" The little girl hesitated a moment and then whispered. "It is nothing, Papa. I just ran in from outside," and she took the trembling hand of her father in her own little warm hands and kissed it. A few days later, Luigi asked for the priest. This was journey's end. The neighbors assembled silently in the room of the dying man. Assunta had placed a crucifix and 2 candles on the white covering of a little table. Holy water and a twig were there too, with a few pieces of cotton. All knelt to recite the rosary while waiting for the priest. Luigi followed the prayers. His lips moved and he tried to answer. Then he drifted off in sleep, and in his last dream memories returned. He saw again the low cottages of Coronaldo with their red tile roofs on the mountain slope. He saw the lofty bell tower from where the Adriatic was visible. Wind whistled through the valley and shook the olive trees. Sheets were spread beneath the branches to catch the precious fruit. The oil press turned in the yard. Again, he climbed the pathway to his field, but it was much steeper now and his breath came short. Pictures became jumbled in his imagination. He opened his eyes. The candles were lit. He looked about at all the neighbors praying. He seemed to be looking for someone. All were hushed in silence. Finally, his gaze set, the eyes of a dying man, glowing like embers on the hearth of a darkened room. Giovanni and Alessandro were standing there in the doorway. Luigi wanted to cry out but was unable to. He tried to rise, but fell back on the pillow. Assunta leaned over him. He murmured in a broken voice that only she could hear. Assunta, go back to Coronaldo. Maria's happiest day. Mother, when will I make my first communion? I can no longer live without Jesus. It was the month of June 1901. Maria Goretti would soon be 11. At that time, it was not customary to receive before 12, except in rare cases. God knows with what ardor the lovely girl longed for that happy day. Divine grace was working within her soul with such strength that it had already aroused an insatiable hunger for the Holy Eucharist. Your first communion? But my child, replied the mother sadly, how can you do it? You can't read and I have nothing to pay for your dress and slippers. We have no time to spare, there is so much work to be done here. At that rate, I can never make my first communion, Maria pleaded, and I want Jesus so badly. What can your poor mother do? It hurts me to see you grow up without instruction, like the animals of the field. Well, mother, if that is the case, don't worry. God will see to it. There is a lady at Conca, Elvira Schiassi, who can read. I will hurry through the housework if you will let me go to Conca to learn the catechism. Besides, Dom Paliana comes from Cisterna every Sunday to teach religion. He will instruct me with the other children preparing for First Communion. The mother consented to the proposal, and for 11 months Maria prepared for that great moment when Lysis would come to her as the bread of life. Her First Communion was a triumph of her tenacious piety over the rather rigid piety of her mother. Without that tenacity and constancy, she probably would have died without ever having received. Once the decision was made, Assunta saw to it that her daughter received instruction. Sometimes she took Maria to Campo Morto or to Conca. Again, she would send Maria to the Passionist Fathers at Nettuno, that she might learn to go to confession and prepare for Holy Communion. From that day, Maria intensified her piety and recollection, her obedience to her mother and her care of brothers and sisters. Playthings and nice clothes had no interest for her. She was busy preparing her soul for her Jesus. One day she returned home beaming. Mamma mia, Dom Signori said I would make my first communion on the feast of Corpus Christi. As the great day approached, Assunta began to wonder if her daughter were really ready. Did she understand the act she was about to perform? Poor Assunta was troubled with anxieties and responsibilities for her Maria. Finally, she set the matter before Dom Temistocles Signori, the archpriest of Nettuno. The wise and holy Dom Signori examined the girl and, filled with admiration at her answers, expressed his complete satisfaction. Be at ease, good mother. Your daughter is very well prepared. Put away all your vain fears and confide her to Mary Immaculate. Place her under the Virgin's protecting mantle and have no fear. Assunta followed the priest's advice, and years later she was able to say my Maria made her first communion like a saint. All Ferrier Hamlet had part in her adornment for that great event. One furnished slippers, another the veil, a third a crown of flowers. Assunta offered her own earrings to enhance the beauty of her daughter. Maria was wrapped in expectation. With tears of joy and compunction she knelt before her mother, her brothers, her sisters, and her neighbors to ask pardon of her faults. 12 other girls and 2 boys composed the First Communion class. A Passionist, Father Jerome, from the retreat of Our Lady of Grace at Nettuno, was the celebrant. During the sermon, he addressed the children with fervent words on the great love of Jesus for them. He exhorted them warmly ever to preserve their souls pure and innocent, and to die rather than commit a mortal sin. He recommended to them the practice of saying 3 Hail Marys each evening in honor of Mary Immaculate. These warm exhortations added fuel to the already growing flame of love in the heart of Maria. What were her words of love to Jesus? What did the divine host say to her at this great tryst of 2 inflamed hearts? The glow of her countenance, the modesty and gravity of her bearing, showed only a feeble glimmer of the light that burned within. While the other children hastened to the sacristy after Mass to thank Father Jerome, Maria remained behind, wrapped in a silent, intimate colloquy with God. A light cloud of sadness veiled the complete joy of this day, the remembrance of her dead father. Maria loved her hard-working father as only an eldest daughter of the poor can love her parent. The hardships of his life were ever present to her mind. His great sacrifice and pain at having to quit this life before having provided for his family were deeply impressed on her memory. Each evening before retiring to rest, she had said the entire rosary for the repose of his soul. Whenever she had passed by the cemetery where he lay, she paused to say a Hail Mary for him. And now, while furtive tears stole down her cheeks, from her heart a fervent prayer went heavenward for her dear father. Throughout the whole day, Maria remained under the spell of the princely visit of that morning. A visible joy beamed in her countenance and colored all her words and actions. Maria, ever docile and obliging, now became ardent in her endeavor to serve and to please. The good Assunta took the occasion to urge her daughter on, "You have received Jesus today. You must try ever so hard now to be good and pleasing to him toward evening." Maria's thoughts started in a new direction. "Oh, when shall I be able to receive Jesus again?" So ended the happiest day of her life. The King of Martyrs had come to nourish with his own body and blood this lily of purity, and the day was not far distant when he would come again and take her home with him. The little woman. Time passed over the grave of Luigi. Life at Ferrier became very sad. Assunta experienced many an hour of deep distress. She had hoped at first to be able to return to her native village. Deep down, she had long been homesick, and besides, it was the last wish of her poor Luigi. But it was necessary to set aside this dream. How could she, with neither money nor assistance, undertake such a journey with her children? Angelo, her eldest, was scarcely 13, so she resigned herself to remaining at Ferrier, where Giovanni had become master. He was harsh and would not even accept her for work in the fields, except on the condition that Maria, now going on 12, take her place in the house. Maria had become one of those children whom hardship and bitter experience of life makes serious beyond their years. She went about her chores with scarcely a smile on her face, a bit of sadness in her deep brown eyes. Overnight, she had changed from a laughing girl to a quiet little woman, preoccupied with her responsibilities. Now Maria must manage the household and care for her little brothers and sisters. Meals, washing, and mending occupied her from early morning to late at night. At any hour of the day she could be seen working about the kitchen, her long chestnut hair curling over her shoulders. It was her pleasure to be helpful, obedient, and obliging. She was tall for her age. One would have taken Maria to be 14 or 15. She was slender and graceful, and with the black shawl over her shoulders, she looked more like the young lady of tomorrow. But her soul was at peace, and quickly she took up each duty. Unfortunately, Maria had never gone to school. She knew not how to read or write. Like her mother before her, she was a poor, unlettered country girl. Her prayers she learned by heart from Assunta, and now, in turn, she was teaching them to her brothers and sisters. When she made her first communion, she was behind the others. To be the poorest, the most humble, was her lot in life. She did not realize, though, that she was likely the richest in virtue and the most loved by him who that day had given himself to her. Soon that great day was slipping into memory, and it seemed as though Maria would be lost in the obscurity of the swampland, for God had chosen her to do no miraculous deeds. She heard no mysterious voices, like Saint Joan of Arc, calling her to feats of battle. The bread she gave to the poor did not turn to roses in her apron, as with Saint Germain. Unlike Saint Bernadette and Saint Therese, Our Lady did not smile on her. Maria expected nothing. Between her morning prayer and her nightly remembrance of her father, she did only the holy will of God. One morning, not long after her first communion, Maria had gone down to the public well in Ferrier to draw water. While waiting for her bucket to fill, she had overheard one of the village girls telling a boy an off-color joke. Maria recognized this girl as one of her companions in the First Communion class and was shocked. How could she so soon forget Jesus? Hurrying home, Maria could not contain herself. Hardly was she in the door when the words tumbled out in a torrent, "Mama, do you know at the well the girl said terrible things and the boy laughed? Why then did you listen?" chided her mother. "I couldn't help it. I had to wait for the bucket to fill." Yes, Assunta nodded wisely. "I know you are astonished that girls and boys talk about such things. Just remember, if you were to say such things, people would be even more astonished at you." Maria could hardly believe her ears. Did her mother really think that she would ever offend God in that dreadful way? "Talk about such things," she said with amazement in her voice. "Why, I would rather die." But all was not serious. At rare intervals, there were innocent distractions in her life. On those days, with her godmother and neighbor, Teresa Cimarelli, she went to market at Nettuno to sell vegetables and eggs. Maria enjoyed those 7 miles of pleasant talk, while their cart jogged along and the pigeons cooed in their cages. She who was so silent now had much to say. Maria at these times refound her childhood gaiety. On these trips, the two would visit the shrine of Our Lady of Grace at Nettuno, and Maria was able to pray to the Blessed Virgin before her famous image. There, in a special way, she could ask Mary Immaculate for grace to persevere each day in goodness, in purity. Unfortunately, these hours were few and passed all too quickly. Tomorrow she would take up her daily routine again. Tomorrow she would muster her courage and begin anew, without complaint, the same old tasks. Little did this girl realize the way that God was leading her, and that on one of those tomorrows she would need the strength of a martyr, the angel of darkness. It was getting close to the end of June. The day had been very sultry, and now with the night there was a bit of cool air creeping up from the swamps. Toads and frogs could be heard croaking for rain, while a hoot owl, nestled in the hollow of an old elm, was sending forth his stupid wail into the night. At Ferrier, behind closed doors, the kitchen fire smoldered to ashes. All was wrapped in sleep, save the white form at the bedside. Maria had not gone to rest. Kneeling in her nightgown for evening prayer, she seemed to continue indefinitely. At the examination of conscience, she had faltered and knew not how to continue. Strange things that day had upset her soul. Examination of conscience, ordinarily so easy and rapid, had now become painful and complicated. There were things that she did not well understand. An evil she could only guess at and yet not know troubled her. She was filled with shame and deep trouble and wondered if she had offended her God. Thoughts of Alessandro, too, frightened her. And now, before God, she recalls everything that had happened. One day last week, her mother had been too tired to work and had remained at home. She had sent Maria to take her place in the fields. It was a pleasure for the girl to help, and she had set out with Alessandro to hoe at the other end of the property. They were alone in the field now, working side by side for more than an hour. Suddenly, Alessandro, throwing aside his hoe, crossed the furrow that separated them and stood before her. He seemed beside himself. His eyes were alight with a strange fire. He seized Maria by the arms, stammering words that she could not grasp. She was stupefied, unable to understand what he wanted. Then it suddenly dawned on her that he was soliciting her to sin. Indignation brought the blood to her face. Violently, she shook herself free and fled down the field. She hid herself in a hedge till noon, and then went in for lunch. In the afternoon, she pretended to return to work with him, but under the pretext of getting a basket in the barn, had climbed to the loft and buried herself in the hay, where she remained motionless for 3 hours. For a whole week she had thus avoided him. Never would she let herself be caught alone with him. She seemed confident he would not try again. But this morning he had surprised her. She had been making the beds. There was no one in the house. He had entered from behind and taken hold of her. She had sunk her nails into his face until he cursed in pain and let her go. Immediately, she had started for the door to call for help, but he was there before her and silenced her with a threat. "If you say a word to your mother, I'll kill you." And he shook his fist before her frightened eyes. Alessandro had gone out, and she had locked herself in her room. She feared he might return, and so she was afraid even to go to the kitchen to prepare the meal. When through the window she saw her mother returning from work, she hurried to start the fire. But it was too late. The soup was not warm by noon, and she had not had time to set the table. She received a harsh scolding. Alessandro, seated before an empty plate, laughed and made sport of her. How it pained her. Once she thought she would tell all. The words were there on her tongue, but she bit her lip. What was the use? Her poor mother could do nothing. And if the evil intentions of Alessandro were known, there would be more wranglings with the Serenellis. Life would become unbearable. Then, too, he had said he would kill her. It would be best to keep her secret to herself. But tonight at her bedside, reliving the painful hours of this sad day, she was unable to keep back her tears. Her whole body trembled, and a wave of fear swept over her. Her throat was dry and tense. She buried her head in the covers, and her prayer terminated in bitter sobs. This was not a childish vexation. From now on, the soul of Maria is different. A veil of sadness clouds her eyes. Her smile is gone. There is nothing left of the little girl, neither laughter nor the playfulness that at times betrayed her 11 years. She understands at last. Her actions are measured, her words are rare. She avoids sitting down at the common table and flees Alessandro, as one might flee a plague. But he seeks her out, as she well perceives. He waits, he watches, he follows her about the house. The cat and mouse story has begun. It is a duel unsuspected even by Assunta. Maria becomes increasingly reticent. The terrible threat rings in her ears, and each time she sees Alessandro, she reads in his eyes, "If you speak, I'll kill you." From now on, Maria lives under a reign of terror. Formerly, when she was small, the ghost stories of her father did not even frighten her. She laughed heartily at them. When she was 8, she was not afraid to cross the yard in blackest night to shut the door of the hen house. And on the way to Mass at Conca, she would run ahead of the rest to beat off the snakes that lay in their path. She could not remember ever having been afraid. But now, whenever she is alone, an indefinable anguish chills her heart. Alessandro might come back. Alessandro might surprise her. Alessandro might overcome her. She feels so weak. But no. A voice in Prava reassures her and tells her she is strong. Who shall be able to overcome God living in her heart, even to blood? It is once more high noon. The sun from its zenith beats down on the Ferrier farm. A burning wind, storm-laden, sweeps across the swamps, licks the walls of the house and enters the kitchen by the open door. The Gorettis and Serenellis, as usual, are seated about the table. They have just finished their lunch. It is so hot that they delay a bit before returning to work. If Giovanni would permit, they would gladly take their siesta. But he insists on working immediately after lunch, and they await his orders. Maria is doing dishes, amidst a silence broken only by the clatter of the plates. Hay and straw are already in the barn, but the unthrashed beans are still spread out in the yard, drying in the sun. Go harness the team, Giovanni orders. There is no time to lose. We will have rain this afternoon. The beans will have to be in beforehand. Slowly Alessandro and Angelo rise. Assunta clears the table and pushes the benches beneath it. The other children scamper out of doors. Giovanni alone does not move. Put the beans in bags and take them up to the loft, he continues. But Alessandro does not hear his father. He has another project in mind. For the past hour, his Eves have followed Maria. Before returning to work, he goes to his room, where he is heard fumbling in his closet. "Maria, I have a torn shirt that needs mending," he calls out. "I'll need it to go to Mass tomorrow." "You'll have to repair it for me this afternoon." "I'm leaving it here for you, and this," he says with studied nonchalance. The dishwashing stopped, but there was no reply. Within the girl's heart, emotion struggled for expression. She felt like crying, "No, I have no time," and it would have relieved her. But in spite of an instinctive repugnance, she consented again to be of service. True charity won out in her heart. While he was harnessing the oxen in the stable, Alessandro's thoughts pursued their evil trend. His plans took definite shape. He visualized the scene. Maria will be quietly seated, and there will be nobody in the house but the baby Teresa. He will hurry in, close the kitchen door, then lock the door. "It will be so easy." "Get up," he calls to the oxen. Then, leaping on the cart, he drives out into the Vard. For want of a thrasher, the Gorettis had improvised a method of their own. The beanstalks were heaped in the yard, and the cart, loaded with youngsters, passed and repassed over the piles. Meanwhile, Assunta turned and shook the lot with her fork. Poor mother, her heart was full as she paused from time to time to witness the job of her little ones. "Look at Angelo," she mused, so like his father directing the cart. "What a consolation he is to me, my eldest. If we can only carry on for a little while longer, perhaps things will be brighter. Then, too, there's my Maria. So good to everyone. She is so sweet and holy. Maybe she's a little too reserved. For the past month, SBCI says her first communion, she seems to be timid and worried. She hardly speaks, and her eyes are always downcast. She blushes so easily, her prayers are prolonged. What can be taking place in her soul? Apparently she has some secret. But then, she is at that age when girls are easily disturbed." Thus, while the oxen turn on the thrashing floor and the children shout and laugh, Assunta pursues the thread of her maternal love, her only joy on earth. Suddenly, Alessandro stops the cart and jumps down. "Take my place for a while," he tells Assunta. "I forgot my handkerchief in my room." "I'll be right back." His forehead is moist with sweat. Obediently, Assunta puts aside her fork and climbs up in his place. The cart is off again, and the joy of children and mother is doubled. Then, as Alessandro disappears through the doorway, a flash of lightning is seen on the horizon and a clap of thunder follows. The storm is approaching. The noonday devil prowls about the Ferrier farm. Meanwhile, Maria is seated on the porch above the kitchen door. It is much too hot within the house. She has taken Alessandro's shirt and found a whole sleeve torn. It will be a long job, but courageously she sets about it, and her needle flies to and fro. Beside her on a blanket, her baby sister Teresa is fast asleep. From the other side of the house, the racket and noise of the thrashing assure her of contentment and hope. Alone, she dreams of the morrow. Tomorrow will be Sunday, feast of the precious blood. "I will start early with Teresa Cimarelli," she tells herself, "so we can get to confession and communion." Her little soul expands already in anticipation. She has so much to tell, so much advice to seek, such great strength to receive. Suddenly, Alessandro looks out of the kitchen door. She jumps with apprehension. He has seen her on the porch. Up the stairway he comes, and without a word passes into the bedroom. Why has he come? She can hear him fumbling with tools in the end room. What is he up to? Perhaps he has forgotten to take a sickle with him. Then he reappears in the doorway. "Maria, come here." His voice is harsh, and she is thoroughly frightened. The sewing drops to her lap, and she neither answers nor moves. "Hear me. Come here immediately." Alessandro is already very impatient. He grabs her by the arm, and though she clings to the banister and calls for help, it is of no avail. He drags her into the house and bolts the door. She is his prisoner, with little chance of escape. Maria pleads desperately, "Alessandro, let me go. Let me go." Alessandro holds up a knife threateningly. It has been sharpened into a pointed dagger. With waves of fear, Maria understands his evil intentions. But in spite of the frightened sobs that climb in her throat, a supernatural energy animates her. She will resist sin to the end, even to death, if need be. Frantically, Maria wrenches free and screams for help. But who can hear amid the noise of the cart and children and beans? She leaps around the table for protection, but he knocks it aside and trips her. As she falls, he pins her, yet she continues to struggle wildly for release. He has not expected such resistance. Maria cries out, "No, I will not." Alessandro, no, her constancy seems only to enrage him. He draws the cruel knife menacingly over her. Maria knows the danger. This brute is now capable of anything. He is getting beside himself with rage. She pleads desperately, "Alessandro, let me go. Let me go." The knife now hangs over her breast. She must choose death or life, heaven or hell, God or Satan, sin or martyrdom. In a burst of heroism, making desperate efforts to free herself, she chooses energetically, superhumanly. No, no, it is a sin. God does not want this. If you do this, you will go to hell. What are you doing, Alessandro? You will go to hell. The tragedy followed. Alessandro said later that something seemed to snap within him. With mad rage, he plunged the steel into her chest and abdomen, then into her back, making 14 wounds in all. "It was just like I was pounding corn, like sticking a knife into a log," he said later. Maria continued to repeat, "God does not want this. You will go to hell." With her right hand, she tried to hold her dress modestly over her knees. Then, mercifully, she lost consciousness. After the blows, Alessandro thought her dead. Dumbfounded, he got up. Blood had sobered him. He threw the knife behind the closet, went to his room and locked the door. The sun was now flooding in by the window. The black clouds were scattering in the distance the storm had passed. The cracking of bean stalks and the shouts of the children continued in the yard. Hours of pain. Outside, the thrashing carried on without respite, though less hurriedly, as the threatening storm had passed. All that remained was to separate the chaff from the grain and gather the precious harvest into the barn. In the evening, a bonfire of stalks would symbolize the family joy and abundance. But Alessandro had not returned. Baby Teresa could be heard crying on the porch, and Assunta became worried. "Mariano, go see what is keeping Alessandro and tell Maria to look after the baby. I'm afraid the child will fall down the stairs." Suddenly a call resounded from the house. "Assunta! Assunta! Come here!" It was Giovanni, yelling as though the house were afire. "What now?" Surely something serious had happened. The poor mother dropped everything and hurried up the stairs and into the room where Maria lay writhing in pain. Close at her heels came her neighbors, Teresa, Cimarelli, and faithful Domenico. All were filled with confusion at the sight of Maria's bloody body and the room in disarray. Tenderly, Domenico lifted Maria and carried her into the bedroom. The sight of the limp form of her daughter was too much for poor Assunta. She grew weak and fell fainting on the floor. When Assunta revived, Teresa was working over Maria and Giovanni was explaining his story. "I was sleeping in the shade beside the house when the baby awoke me with her crying. I didn't pay much attention to that, but then I heard Maria calling with a feeble voice from the doorway. So I got up, and just in time to see her fall in the doorway. She had fainted, so I shouted for Assunta and all of you. I don't know what happened, but look, her dress is blood-stained." Assunta leaned over her daughter Maria. "What has happened?" The girl made no reply. Apparently she was suffocating. With her hands, she was trying to undo her clothing. Her mother lent a hand, unhooking and loosening the blouse, and a trickle of red blood crept across her throat. With infinite precaution, the two women raised her a bit and slid out her arms from the sleeves and removed the blouse. Her underclothing was all saturated with blood. On her breast near the heart, the thin blade had made a narrow but deep entry. 4 gashes crisscrossed the stomach. The whole of that little body was horribly torn. Blood congealed about the wounds and trickled in drops upon the sheet. The heroic child did not even whimper. It was her rest after the battle, repose after victory. Her long, disheveled hair formed an aureole beneath her head. Her discolored lips remained closed. They had not yet revealed the name of the assailant. "Maria, my little one, tell me what has happened. Who did this to you?" Maria hesitated a bit. Then, raising her large, innocent eyes to her mother, she whispered, "It was Alessandro, Mama." "Who, Alessandro? But why?" Maria seemed to reflect before speaking. The whole drama repassed swiftly before her eyes. Then quietly she answered, "Because he wanted to commit an awful sin, and I would not." There was the secret of her martyrdom. The two women dared not pry further. Meanwhile, there was much going on outside. Domenico had hitched up his cart and had hurried off to get a doctor at Nettuno. Along the way, he notified neighbors, and the tragic news flew from farm to farm. A crime committed at Ferrier Maria attacked. Housework, plowing, gardens, and sheep were abandoned, and the whole countryside seemed to flock to the old cheese factory. Some of the men carried pitchforks, others clubs, and still others came with rifles. No one knew what to expect. Soon the house was thronged. Women were getting in each other's way, and everybody wanted to see the little victim. She was so sweet and good. Some wept, others whispered in little groups. With each newcomer, the details were told again, and Alessandro's name was repeated over and over. The blood on the floor seemed to tell its own story. Suddenly, there was a commotion. Someone discovered the knife behind the closet. Indignation flared up. Tempers grew hot. "Alessandro, where's Alessandro?" "He must be here," shouted one of the men, trying the door. But the door is barred from the inside. Several tried to force the oak panel with their shoulders. Someone suggested getting a crowbar. Then Count Mazzoleni came rushing in. Seeing the men struggling to get at Alessandro, he tried to calm them. "No, wait, better notify the police. They'll come and arrest him," for Mazzoleni feared that these excited men might only add murder to murder. So two of the farmers then rushed off for the police, one to Nettuno and the other to Saturna. But so many people and such turmoil in the next room was fatiguing to Maria. In vain did she beg to be left alone with her mother and godmother. Each one thought his or her presence necessary in the room. Only Dr. Bartoli's arrival restored order, and everyone was put out of the house. The doctor made his examination quickly. The case was most serious. An operation was necessary. Another messenger was sent for an ambulance to bring Maria to the hospital. First aid was administered, and with the help of bed sheeting, the poor body was bandaged temporarily. Precious time slipped by in waiting for the ambulance, and though the others were impatient, Maria remained quiet. Her body was weakening steadily. Since 2:00 that afternoon, she had been bleeding, and it was 6:00 before the horse-drawn ambulance arrived. The final struggle. The stretcher had to be brought right up to the bedside. Maria had become limp. Painful gasps escaped her when the doctor and Domenico roused her, though they were ever so gentle. They laid her on the stretcher, covered her with a blanket, and carried her down to the ambulance at the bottom of the stairway. Neighbors crowded around to see their Maria for the last time. Her brothers and sisters climbed into the wagon to kiss her goodbye. She was haggard, pale, and disfigured. Tears welled up in her dark eyes and stole furtively down her cheeks. Assunta took her position at her head. The doctor sat up with the driver, and they were off. This was Maria's farewell to Ferrier and theirs to her. White pigeons careened overhead, turning and fluttering about the roof she called home. Many a time Maria had traveled these 7 miles of dusty road to Nettuno. Many happy trips she had made along this way with Teresa Chimarelli to sell their poultry and eggs. Other times, too, she had gone this way with her dear mother to visit the shrine of Our Lady of Grace. She had been able to laugh then and enjoy life, which seemed pleasant in spite of hardships. But now her teeth are clenched, her face is set, and her hands clutch the side of the stretcher. The road is rough, the horses unsteady, and with every jolt her whole body is dipped anew in a flood of pain. "Are you suffering, my little one?" Assunta asks. Maria makes an effort to smile. Yes, Mama, a little. Have we still far to go? With great effort, she turns her head a little to the side, trying to recognize some familiar landmark trees along the way, the cemetery fence, the iron cross at the fork in the road. At last they reach the bridge over the canal, the halfway mark. How long these 7 miles seem. Pain racks her body. Even breathing is painful. Stiffly her head returns to the cushion, her feverish eyes stare up into the blue heavens, which never seemed so beautiful as. Now, at a bend in the road, 2 mounted policemen hurried past the ambulance. Between their 2 horses, a handcuffed man was dragged on foot. Assunta was not able to conceal her surprise. In the perspiring, dust-covered runner, she recognized Alessandro. Fortunately, Maria had seen nothing. As they entered Nettuno, crowds gathered and escorted the ambulance. The sad story had preceded them. The arrival of the criminal had been witnessed at the prison gates with threatening tumult. At the Orsenigo hospital doorway, throngs had gathered in silent awe. Everybody wanted to see the heroine. And they did see her, as the stretcher was borne up the stairway. Surrounded by a wave of chestnut hair, a beautiful, innocent face looked kindly out on them and tried to smile. When the doors of the hospital shut her from their eyes, the crowd dispersed and some were heard to murmur. She's a real martyr. The voice of the people had already canonized Maria Goretti. Yet she had not achieved her full measure of suffering. A second time she must experience the knife on her flesh. The hospital chaplain came to visit her on the operating table. She betrayed no concern, but gladly went to confession. Perhaps she scarcely believed death to be near. At such an early age, one does not feel death's approach. The body is too well equipped for reaction against even the most severe suffering. As the priest was leaving, a surgeon whispered in his ear, "Where you have found an angel, I am afraid we will leave but a corpse." 14 wounds were discovered. The intestines were torn, the lungs were pierced completely through, and the heart grazed. The lower bone structure was seriously injured, showing 4 chest wounds and 5 in the abdominal region. Added to this were 5 minor gashes. Stitching and bandaging only added torture to the poor sufferer. In spite of her intense pain, she remained calm, invoking the Blessed Virgin Mary. The surgical work continued for 2 long hours. No anesthetic was administered because the attendants feared peritonitis. Finally, she lost consciousness. When Assunta entered the sick room, she thought her child was dead, and she began to cry. Little by little, Maria recovered. Her eyelids slowly opened. She called for water, but that relief had to be denied her. She willingly accepted the sacrifice in remembrance of Jesus' thirst on the cross. She was told not to speak, but she had difficulty in understanding that, because she felt she was much better. Her sufferings had abated somewhat. She remained motionless. Her body was completely wrapped as in a cast. Only her arms were outside the covers, but she could not move them without great pain. Her bloodless hands were cold and white, and her feet like ice. Towards 10 o'clock in the evening, she seemed to be slipping into a coma. She moaned continually. Doctor Bartoli dropped in again before leaving the hospital for the night. He urged Assunta to go and take some rest. A nurse would remain with Maria. When finally the poor mother agreed to go, the noise of the chair on the stone floor awoke the sufferer. She guessed that her mother was leaving. An effort of protest came to her, but the word was not uttered. Courageous to the end, she accepted still another sacrifice. Throughout the night, in a half-conscious state, she moaned as though hot flames bathed her body. Spasms of pain racked her nerves. Every now and then a convulsion would bring an involuntary cry to her lips. At dawn, exhausted, she fell into a labored sleep. At 5 o'clock, Dr. Bartoli returned. He found her sleeping. Her respiration was regular but scarcely perceptible. A half hour later, she awoke with a groan. She seemed to remember nothing that had happened. When Assunta entered with the hospital chaplain, a light smile passed over Maria's face. She told her mother that she felt well, inquired where she had passed the night, spoke of her brothers and sisters, and said she would like to see them. Her thoughts went back to Ferrier without any fright. The name of Alessandro did not cross her lips, nor did anyone dare recall to her mind the tragic events of the preceding day. When the priest offered to bring her Holy Communion, her face lit up with evident joy. She had been expecting that visitor. Slowly she crossed her hands on her breast and asked her mother to raise the pillow a bit. Her soul was ready, but there remained one more heroic act before her final tryst with God. The chaplain reminded her of how Jesus had pardoned his murderers when he died upon the cross. She seemed to reflect. Her eyes rested upon the crucifix on the wall. Then, with voice expressive of her generous soul, she said, "Yes, for the love of Jesus I too pardon him, and I want him to be with me in heaven." Assunta wept. The priest too brushed away the tears as he turned to get the Blessed Sacrament. In a few moments he was back, and Maria received her dear Jesus in Holy Viaticum. 10 o'clock that morning, Dr. Bartoli returned to change the dressings. Great violet scabs had formed about the wounds. Black and blue lumps now showed on knee, legs, and elbow, indicating with what desperate efforts the child had defended herself. But these were only slight injuries compared to the wounds she had received. The perforation of the intestines was especially grave. Internal hemorrhages were threatening blood poisoning that could carry her off within a few hours. The doctor saw by the failing respiration that the end was not far off. During the morning, Sergeant Fantini came to question the victim and draw up a charge against Alessandro. Maria answered calmly in monosyllables, without showing the least resentment. When she was asked where the dagger had struck, she pointed very simply to the wounds in her breast, adding modestly, "And elsewhere he and the carabinier dared not inquire further." When Assunta was again alone with her daughter, she asked if Alessandro had not tried to seduce her at other times. Maria admitted simply that there were 2 other attempts, which she had rejected. "But why didn't you tell me about it?" Assunta pleaded. "Because he said he would kill me if I did then," with a sigh. "And you see, he killed me anyway." By now Maria was failing fast. Extreme unction was administered, and for 3 hours she battled with an invisible enemy. Her head swayed on the pillow, her hands clenched. "Alessandro, Alessandro, let me go. No, no, no. You will go to hell. Mama, mama." Help. The memory of the struggle haunted her delirium. Some moments of lucidity pierced through those trying hours. "Mama," she said, "forgive me." The mother's answer was a mother's kiss. The last agony began at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Maria's eyes settled on the statue of Our Lady placed at the foot of her bed. Suddenly her lips stammered. Teresa, the nurse, took her icy hand. "Your baby sister is not here." Maria, a long spasm shook her whole body. Her muscles tensed. She threw back her head violently against the pillow. A long gasp seemed to tear out her lungs. Her head settled calmly on the pillow. The light in her beautiful eyes went out. Maria had breathed her last. God had already rewarded her victory. It was July 6, 1902, the first Sunday in July, Feast of the Precious Blood. Out over the city, bells were ringing the Vesper hour. In the nearby church, Passionists were chanting the antiphon from Vespers of the Feast of the Precious Blood. "Who is this that cometh? This beautiful one. Why then is thy apparel red, and thy garments like theirs that tread in the winepress?"